O nosso próximo painel, muito importante, vai falar sobre como construindo e sustentando um setor próspero em mercados emergentes e desenvolvidos. Os caminhos para o crescimento das nações. E para moderar esse painel, I want to call Ivanovski. Originally from Macedonia, university educated in the United States, Ivo Ivanovski began his career in the U.S. with Plaskolite, Inc., the largest privately owned plexiglass manufacturer in the world. In 2006, he returned to Macedonia to serve as a Minister of Information Society and Administration, a role to which he was reappointed for 9 consecutive years. And I just learned in backstage that at one point in time, he was the youngest minister of all of Europe. Anyways, an active member of the International Telecommunication Union, he was elected in 2013 to be chairman of the 5th World Telecommunication and Information Technology Policy Forum in Geneva, where all 6 opinions were accepted with full consensus, and Ivanovski was awarded the ITU Silver Medal. He was a member of the Broadband Commissioner for Digital Development since inception until September 2015. He was an organizer of the 2014 Regional Internet Governance Forum, hosted by Macedonia. For many years, he has held the seat in the board of the Global Alliance for ICT and Development under United Nations DESA, and currently he is a member of the advisory committee of the World Information Technology and Services Alliance. In 2015, Ivanovski returned to private industry with America's Movility, working as head of government and regulatory affairs for Europe. Please, salva de palmas para Ivo Ivanovski. We're going to have the honor to receive again and hear from Dr. Kati Suominen. And for those who were not here earlier, she's the founder and CEO of the Nextrade Group, an innovative research firm that helps governments, international organizations, and Fortune 500 companies to drive trade and digitalization worldwide. And she also is responsible for TradeUp Capital Fund, a growth capital platform for globalizing companies. She is also the adjunct professor at UCLA Anderson School of Management, adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and senior advisor to the World SME Forum. A business and policy entrepreneur, Dr. Kati is the ideal woman behind such major initiatives as E-Trade for All, a global multi-stakeholder initiative to accelerate e-commerce development worldwide, now championed by the United Nations, and RTA Exchange, a forthcoming global forum on trade governments sponsored by the Inter-American Development Bank and Asia Development Bank. She is also the founder and coordinator of the Private Sector Advisory Council to E-Trade for All. She has published over 80 articles and 9 books, and she currently now is working on her 10th book, Globalization 4.0, How Disruptive Technologies Revolutionize World Trade and Open Opportunities for All. Please welcome Dr. Kati Suominen. Salve de palmas. We are honored to receive the presence of Dr. Glória Guimarães. Ms. Guimarães graduated as a technologist in data processing and an MBA in strategic management of information systems from Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Is the chief executive at SERPRO, accumulating the director supervisor role. Developed career in the Banco do Brasil Technology, where she was a director of technology and operations for the Brazil's Alliance in Insurance. IT Director of BB Tourism, Secretary of Logistics and Information Technology for the Ministry of Planning. Vice President of the Postal Operations and Chief Supervisor for SERPRO, and Director of Management of the Brazilian Agencies for the Guarantors of Funds and Guarantees, ABGF. Please, salva de palmas, Senhora Glória Guimarães. Miguel Porrua. It's a pleasure to have him as an e-government expert for the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. He's a lead specialist with institutional capacity also of the State Division. Miguel Porrua is the e-government lead specialist at the IFD ICS unit in the International American Development Bank. Prior to this position, Miguel was a senior government specialist at the OAS, Organization of American States, managing their organization's e-government's portfolio. And also then, he was previously a director of government relations for GovWorks, based in New York, where he oversaw various electronic government projects. Prior to his U.S. arrival, Miguel resided in Uruguay, managing projects related to the modernization of the public sector for the Spanish government, Spanish Agency for International Cooperation and Development, AECID, and the United Nations. Miguel obtained his bachelor's degree in business economics at the University of Oviedo, Spain, and the MBA from Thunderbird Business School, Arizona, United States. Miguel has written several articles and documents on electronic government and co-edited the book LatinAmerican.gov. His most recent article, E-Government in Latin America, a review of the success in Colombia, Uruguay, and Panama, has been published in the Global Information Technology Report 2013 of the World Economic Forum. Please, salva de palmas para Miguel Porrua. And to close our panel, we will have André Luiz Souza Limp de Azevedo, International Business Analyst and Trade Sector Project Supervisor at Apex Brazil. André Limp works at the Brazilian Trade Investment Promotion Agency for the past 10 years and has been serving as such as a senior specialist on a variety of international business development matters, including exports, investment promotion, international business strategy, sustainable competitiveness, high growth, and emerging markets. Prior to working for the Brazilian federal government, André worked for 8 years as business director at a Brazilian private firm in the ICT solutions segment. André graduated with a bachelor's degree from the University of Brasilia in computer science and received the post-graduation diplomas in business administration and marketing from the University of California at Berkeley. And he also holds a master's degree from Fundação Dom Cabral and PUC Minas Gerais in international business. His main areas of interest is in the field of international business strategies for emerging economies. Please welcome André Limp. Please, Ivo, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be again here in Brazil. Jim, thank you again for your kind invitation, and it's my pleasure to be a moderator of such a distinguished group of panelists. What we are going to try to do in the next 50 minutes is to discuss about what is needed in order for countries, governments, private sector to create a sustainable ICT sector. We'll talk about the deficit of the ICT people. They're interested to study information communication technologies. We'll talk about some of the measurements that governments are doing in order to stimulate young people to study these highly valuable industry sectors in information communication technologies. We'll discuss about what measurements have governments done with cooperation with the private sector in order to create a startup ecosystem, in order to have enterprises of ICT. And we'll talk about brain drain, something that is a challenge for a lot of the less developing country, emerging markets, in order to keep the professionals to work in the country where the country invested in them. So these are a lot of topics. I think we will have your interest. I know it's first panel immediately after lunch. Hopefully you've had a lot of black coffee. If not coffee, maybe you've tried the guarana, the Brazilian drink. It's the Red Bull of Brazil. And we will try to entertain you, and we'll leave a lot of time for questions and answers. So first, I would like to go with Glória, open up the discussion to see what is going on in Brazil. What is the largest agency of the Brazilian government doing in the ICT sector? So, Glória, please, you have the floor.
Eu acho que sim. Boa tarde a todos. Eu gostaria de agradecer o convite para participar nesse evento maravilhoso com essas pessoas muito importantes dentro da área de TI. Então, muito obrigada. Parabenizo a WCIT pela organização do evento, na pessoa do seu presidente, senhor Santiago Gutierrez, e do seu secretário-geral, senhor Jim Poisson. E também o presidente da SERPRO, o senhor Giovanni, que é o anfitrião do WCIT no Brasil e que gentilmente nos convidou para participar. Então, saudar o moderador e todos os participantes, e muito me honra participar desse importante evento. Eu gostaria, em primeiro lugar, de mostrar um pouquinho quem somos o SERPRO num pequeno vídeo, gentileza.
Especializado na prestação de serviços em tecnologia da informação para o setor público e presente em todos os estados do país, o SERPRO desenvolve sistemas que facilitam a gestão pública e a vida de todos os cidadãos. O imposto de renda, por exemplo. Com ele, você envia sua declaração em poucos minutos. É rápido, prático e seguro. O CIAF, que trouxe mais eficiência para a execução orçamentária, financeira e patrimonial do governo federal. O Porto Sem Papel, que desburocratizou e agilizou a atividade portuária. E o Siscomex, que garantiu mais segurança às operações de importação e exportação, são alguns dos sistemas desenvolvidos pelo SERPRO, que contribui para a modernização do Estado brasileiro. Para garantir a total preservação, integridade e autenticidade dos dados armazenados, o SERPRO conta ainda com centro de dados que são referência em segurança e desempenho. SERPRO, líder em soluções de TI para governo.
Bem, muito obrigada. Isso é um pouquinho dos desafios que a gente tem à frente numa das partes do governo do Brasil, que é uma empresa de processamento de dados. Enfim, quando a gente fala de um importante tema como esse, a gente tem que falar de governo digital. E quando a gente fala de governo digital, eu lembro muito o que aconteceu nos bancos há cerca de 15 anos. Eu sou oriunda da indústria bancária, então eu lembro que há 15 anos, quando a gente queria resolver algum problema, a gente ia a uma agência do banco e ficava lá à tarde resolvendo seus problemas de empréstimo, financiamentos de casa, enfim, todo o serviço bancário você tinha que resolver na agência. Hoje, a gente simplesmente pega um iPhone e coloca ele, e todos os sistemas que você tem em conversa com o banco estão ali naquele dispositivo móvel ou nos dispositivos de sua casa. Então, a gente acabou aprendendo a ter uma conversa digital com os bancos, né? E no governo não seria diferente. Nós, como cidadãos, eu acredito muito que nós também queremos ter uma conversa digital, e para isso o governo precisa ter esse diálogo digital, né? Como é que é isso? Hoje, quando a gente quer um serviço de governo, por exemplo, nós vamos tirar o passaporte. A gente tem que ir até a Polícia Federal, fazer uma série de... Vai lá, preenche seu nome, seu endereço. Aí, se você precisar ir num serviço de previdência, ou você entra num sítio específico de previdência e com login e senha, ou você tem que ir lá na agência de previdência para resolver seu problema. E hoje nós temos soluções que já nos permitem ter um único registro do cidadão. Então, eu tenho um único registro do cidadão e, com ele, eu posso disponibilizar um portal para poder ter todos esses serviços, saúde, educação e todos os serviços que o cidadão precisa para poder ter essa conversa com o governo. Então, isso, além de ser muito bom para o cidadão, que não precisa se deslocar, gastar tempo, né, tem o serviço à sua disposição, tem a segurança desse serviço dentro do país, ao mesmo tempo, para o governo também é vantajoso, porque você consegue fazer uma gestão com qualidade de todos os serviços que são oferecidos. Onde é que a gente entra aí? Bom, o SERPRO, como sendo uma das principais empresas do governo de prestação de serviço, sabe que esse é um movimento importantíssimo e que nessa linha a gente procura trabalhar com inovação. Para falar de inovação, nós buscamos uma pesquisa do Gartner e do The Economist, onde ele dizia o seguinte, que cerca de 15% da inovação em TI, ela vem dos setores internos da própria TI. E 45% aproximadamente, ela vem do próprio usuário, do cliente, do cidadão, como você queira chamar. Então, essa abordagem holística do cidadão, junto com o nosso colaborador, juntamente com o governo, juntamente com a indústria de TI, é que faz com que ocorra essa cadeia de desenvolvimento para a inovação. Então, nesse aspecto, nós acreditamos muito nisso. Para isso, nós temos um portal aberto de inovação e também, para operacionalizar isso, a gente faz os hackathons, que é a forma da gente chegar até o nosso cidadão, da gente chegar até o governo, enfim, propor novas políticas e diretrizes nesse sentido. Outro aspecto importante também, quando a gente fala de governo digital e como a gente chegar ao desenvolvimento através da TI, a gente fala do importante papel do governo de fazer essa interoperabilidade para garantir a comunicação entre esses movimentos e para que a gente possa ter um padrão adequado. Certamente o meu colega Pagotti, que é lá da Secretaria de TI do governo, ele vai falar um pouquinho sobre essa questão da governança dos dados abertos e nos permitir saber um pouco mais sobre isso. Então, a gente acredita muito que a forma de chegar até o nosso cidadão é na prestação de um serviço, nesse modelo, um governo digital para atender o nosso cidadão e, ao mesmo tempo, a gente poder devolver com qualidade o investimento que o cidadão faz no Estado.
Thank you very much. Thank you for portraying a picture of what the Brazilian government is doing in order to stimulate e-services in Brazil. I think that's a very important segment where replacing the actual services, putting them online, B2G, G2B, C2G, G2C, that is an important step that the governments can do in order even to stimulate the private sector to develop applications. Now, for me, I can say that it's a miracle how startup companies, when they look at ideas when they have, that idea, depending of in which part of the world is seated, in which part of the world that application is developed, the value varies tremendously. I have come up with a definition, in a way, of geographical prejudice in ICT. Because if the same idea is created in Brazil, same application, and the same idea is created in Israel, or is created in Europe, or in India, and China, it's not going to be valued the same as in the Silicon Valley. So that's a challenge for many countries, many startups. They can have wonderful solution, but having the address of the Silicon Valley means quite a lot to the investors, means quite a lot to the end users. For some reasons, the end users feel more comfortable when they see an address that the company was started up in the Silicon Valley. Not everything is so wonderful in the Silicon Valley. The rate of failure is over 90%, but the majority of the world is combined over there when it comes to startups. So I would like to invite Andre to talk about what are some of the key indicators that in the emerging markets, Brazil, especially Latin America, what are they doing to stimulate startups to begin their dream in their home country, develop it, stay there, and then try to sell it? Would you please share with us some of your ideas and what are some of the measurements that you're doing to attract investors in the ICT environment?
Thank you, Ivo. Happy and honored to be here representing Apex Brazil. It's the Brazilian Trade and Investment Promotion Agency. We support over 10,000 Brazilian companies from over 70 different economic sectors. So we have a lot of field experience to share. Specifically in the ICT sector, we support over 250 companies that are engaged in their international expansion. So many of what we see relates not only to our domestic market, but also can be applicable to other emerging markets. And it's also very important for these companies to compete not only inside Brazil, but mostly in a global scenario as we are living right now. So just to give you some, I just want to share some figures about the ICT sector in Brazil, and then I'll proceed to the more specific answer in terms of what we can do to retain good companies and make the ICT sector in Brazil thrive. So we are the largest Latin American ICT market right now, with a 52% market share, around $160 billion value in terms of market size. Seventh world largest market, with somewhere around 8.2% annual growth average for the past 4 years. So it's a very dynamic sector. And what we see is very, very diversified and transversal sector. It's 200,000 companies and operating in Brazil, the vast majority for SMEs. Maybe that's an interesting topic for us to explore later on during the panel. And we also have some anchor companies in Brazil, like Stefanini and Todos, who are very dynamic and very internationalized, and some other big players like IBM, SAP, Google, and Microsoft operating in Brazil for many, many years. So this makes our ICT sector very, very dynamic and very international in terms of how the business strategy moves along. Coming back to your question, Ivo, one of the main agendas that we work within the federal government point of view to make the ICT sectors thrive in Brazil is based mostly on 3 different pillars. First one we call infrastructure, but by that I don't restrain my vision to only the physical infrastructure or the hard infrastructure, so to speak. For example, laying miles and miles of fiber optic cables and make connectivity happen. What we try to do is work on the soft infrastructure agendas, and for us that include important tools and mechanisms like big data management, business analytics that allow companies to formulate their strategies, and also some of the tools that make our companies in the domestic market competitive on a sustainable way. So when we say infrastructure is doing fine in Brazil, by having such a diversified sector and such a large geographical area to cover, we have to think about infrastructure in these 2 dimensions, soft and hard. So that's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is regulation. So we've been hearing many, many interesting comments since yesterday about how well and integrated the ICT sectors around the world must be in terms of rules and regulation, because technology is propelling us forward to a global stage, and if we are not integrated and well regulated with the intervention of organisms like the WTO, for example, it's very hard to make emerging economies, ICT sectors, be integrated in the global scenario and benefit from these new technologies that have appeared in the past few years. So regulation would be pillar number 2. And last but not least, we'll call capacity building, which is making Brazilian companies ready to perform well over the long run. As you know, emerging markets like Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and some other markets in Latin America we are close to, we have suffered some of the impacts of the economic crisis that started back in 2008 and 9. And if the companies are not based on a sustainable strategy to compete domestically and internationally, they tend to move along by going back and forth in the international market, depending on what the macroeconomic scenario is. So what we see is that the competitive company in Brazil, they would react to macroeconomic movements, but not simply break the strategy apart and then try to go somewhere else. So capacity building for us means making companies perform well technologically, taking advantage of all the innovation that has been going through the global scenario, but also to be ready as companies and as managers and as organizational culture environments to strive in the international scenario. So I will resume for these 3 pillars. That's the main agendas we are working with within the federal government agenda, is to make companies be in an environment that's well regulated, to have capacity building tools and mechanisms to make them robust companies, and also taking advantage of all the infrastructure that is being laid on and have to be used well enough for them to be competitive. So that should be it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very well put. I think it's important to get the message that it's important when governments are pro-business oriented, pro-investment oriented, where the private sector will have a security in the regulation, regardless which party runs the government. Doesn't matter if it's an election every 2 years, 4 years, or every 5 years. For the private sector, it's very important to have a stable regulation. So when they create their strategy, they know what are they up for next 4 years, 8 years, or 12 years. So that is a very good segue for my next panelist, Miguel from the Inter-American Development Bank, because I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of countries are facing with challenges to stimulate the young people to follow their career, their path in the ICT sector. I think everybody wants to use Pokemon, but nobody wants to start developing Pokemon because it's very difficult. So can you share with us some of the numbers, maybe if you have the study that you have done with your organization? What are some of the deficit numbers that you have come across? And what is something that the governments are not doing? We heard what governments are doing, but what governments are not doing in order to stimulate the ICT sector?
Sure. Thank you, Ivo. And let me thank WCIT for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, sharing ideas and numbers with everyone. And thank you in particular to Jim Poissant. One thing that was not said about Twitter is that the pictures of everyone having an app is being tweeted. So your bosses are very happy. Those of you that are sleeping, they're just asking to come back with a report about what you are dreaming while you are sleeping. But other than that, just enjoy the nap, okay? Well, jokes aside, let me just quickly, in the 3 minutes left, say that what we're discussing here, how do we push forward the ICTs and along the lines the private sector companies, I think requires serious policy making. And I'm happy that Mr. Mora was here because he understands both sides of the equation very well, actually. I hope he's in the audience and he can jump in during the Q&A. And the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean region, which is a region I can speak with more knowledge, is, I would say, worrisome. Let me tell you that out of 32 Latin American and Caribbean countries, just 17 of them have an e-government strategy. Not even a national digital agenda, an e-government strategy, something even at the lower level. We just finished a study along with the OECD that is going to be published in a publication called Government at a Glance. So this is fresh numbers. That poses a problem because in most of the countries where there is a thriving ICT sector, there is a government that is investing in ICT. It has an agenda. So one of the things we have to solve in the region is having national agendas. Here, the private sector can be of great support. Let me mention, and I'm coming to the numbers, some of the, I would say, challenges or reasons why there are many more agendas in the region. One is the lack of leadership. We know it's in page number 1 of every manual, right? You need a champion, you need a leader. And that is something where the private sector comes in very handy. Places like Colombia had the fortune of having a minister that was borrowed from Telefónica, from the private sector, to lead Vive Digital. Places like Uruguay and some other places had the privilege of counting on leaders that moved from the private sector to the public sector to lead digital agendas. That is where the private sector can be of great help. The talent, the numbers that you mentioned. The region is missing, the studies that you mentioned, in fact, were done by Gartner, not even by the bank. In Mexico is missing 115,000 ICT professionals. Colombia, according to the Minister of ICTs, about 50,000. This is nothing new for many of those of you here that belong to this region. There is difficulty to find talent in the ICT world, where, again, that's when the private sector can join efforts with the public sector to come up with training, with curriculums in universities to accelerate the pool of available professionals. With an additional element, the fact, and I was shocked to hear that, in fact, in Argentina 2 weeks ago, that teenagers do not feel particularly attracted to this ICT world. They think that this coding thing and the IT architecture is something that isolates you in a room, is not cool. So we need to make an effort to make it appealing for teenagers, or else we'll have difficulties to find candidates to join the ranks of the engineers of the region. And the third element that is, I think, somehow just delaying the advance of the digital agendas in the region is the lack of investment. The famous English sentence of put your money where your mouth is, right? There's some politicians that are buying into the speech and they understand the importance of the digital economy, they understand the changes that are happening around, but at the end of the day, when there is a need to invest, I see a lack of resources in many of the governments of the region, which takes us to a very interesting point that George made before the language, which is the return on investment. That is something that for the bank where I work is very important. And that is, again, something where the private sector can help the public sector big deal, which is building cases, building demonstration cases with good numbers that become convincing for the Ministry of Finance, so he put the money on the table to invest in ICT projects. So I'm sorry I'm touching upon the things very superficially, but I want to respect the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are wonderful key points, lack of leadership, lack of investment. I can also add lack of commitments, because a lot of governments, they're open to hear the problems for the private sector, and they commit to it before elections, but as soon as they win, that follow-up is not there. So now we come to the private sector. We got from the government sector, we went to the multinational organization, now the private sector. Kati, can you share with us some of your ideas, what you have seen? What are the good models where there's a good government and private sector cooperation, please?
Yeah, it's a great question, and if I take a look at this more broadly, given we're here with the experts and I come more from the, perhaps from the trade perspective, And part of this is adoption of ICT, not only by countries in general, but also by companies in any one sector, whether it's manufacturing, in agriculture and services. And if we take a step back, what we see, what Andre was talking about, the competitiveness of companies very much hinges on their technology intensity. You see in research over and over that companies that are technology intensive tend to be also more productive, tend to be paying higher wages, and tend to be much likelier to participate in international trade, i.e. compete on the global stage than companies that don't have the technology capabilities. And I think as we go forward, ICT adoption by companies is going to be even more relevant in terms of determining who participates in trade and who competes successfully. So it's a broader issue than just kind of creating an ICT sector. It's more about how to diffuse the ICT across these different companies. And what I've seen in research is a rather scant use and adoption of ICT by companies in general. If we go back to the prior panel on e-commerce, for instance, in developing countries, in the lower income countries, only 9% of the small companies, only 16% of mid-sized companies use any e-commerce. Even in the upper middle income countries, middle-sized companies, mid-market companies that are very advanced, only 35% of them use e-commerce. 20% of companies have online payments and things like that. So these technologies are around, and they've been around for 20 years, but many companies just don't adopt them. We do see the same in advanced markets. I actually did a study on the level of digitization of American companies across the board in different sectors, and the executives themselves assigned themselves in the US grading system a C+ average, that they hadn't done enough to digitize their companies. In European Union, as we look at the numbers, I was actually stunned by this, that 80% of companies have online presence and websites, only 19% use cloud computing, about the same amount sell online, 4% have RFID technologies. You would think that these are pretty straightforward to adopt and so forth, but very few companies still have put them to use. So I think there's a lot of latent potential sitting around there. What I worry about in terms of development is a bit of this kind of divergence between the advanced countries and the advanced sectors where there's a lot of ICT adoption, and the lower income countries where there's much less of this. And we've seen that technologies have been diffusing very slowly. Steamships, when they started in the UK, diffused 120 years later in developing countries. So it took 120 years before the technology took off in developing countries, and it diffused very slowly. With newer technologies like PCs or the internet, the adoption rates are much faster. It takes you maybe 20 years, 25 years, but then the diffusion is still rather limited. And of course, as advanced economies build more on internet and build more ICT capabilities, I worry that if we don't get the adoption rates fast enough and high enough in developing countries, we have another great divergence that we have in the past 200 years, where advanced economies race forward and developing countries kind of fall behind. So a couple of recommendations, pretty straightforward. I think it's the e-skills, first of all, that companies seem to cite in the United States, in developing countries, that they don't have enough talent to absorb the technologies and to leverage them effectively. And necessarily, there isn't always management buy-in either in place. So those are some of the key elements. And I guess in Latin America, when we look at Latin American countries compared to peer economies of the same income level, we tend to have lower e-skill levels in Latin America, starting from primary schools, secondary schools, than comparable countries with, in the same income brackets as advanced economies. So I think there's an education process there. There's certainly public-private partnerships, as was mentioned. In e-commerce, we've seen these eBay, TradeKey, other platforms supported by governments or public agencies doing a lot, helping companies adopt e-commerce and pushing them to international markets. And the final, perhaps something that surprised me, is the liberalization of economies in general. The Philippines is a wonderful case where the services sector and business process outsourcing is very liberalized and very technology intensive. Then you look at the manufacturing side, not so liberalized, a lot of barriers from external competition, and not that technology intensive, because there hasn't been an incentive for the Filipino manufacturing firms to digitize, because they've been shielded by foreign competition. So, trade policy also plays a big role in furthering this and forcing countries to take leadership in this area.
Thank you very much. I want to ask one more question to Glória, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&As. But Kati mentioned that there is a big demand, not enough talent in the developing countries. Since your organization is probably the single most largest IT employer in Brazil, what are some of the key benefits that your company allows to attract the IT specialists to come? And what is the competition with the public and the private sector attracting the ICT experts? Okay. Andre or Glória, however, Andre, would you like to take that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Just to share some ideas on what we've seen. What we see over the long run is that technology and innovation spreads very quickly, and they become accessible through a relatively short period of time. So if you see these two environments as public sector and private sector separately, at some point in time, one is going to be a first mover and the other one is going to be a follower. So there are some challenges on the short run, but over the long run, they tend to come to an equilibrium point. So over the long run, we believe that the whole economy benefits from technological advances, and these market movements will, at the end of the day, will make the whole domestic market more competitive. So we see that in some of the technology-intensive sectors we work with within Apex Brazil agenda. And when I say technology-intensive, I don't mean only the ICT, because very typically technology-intensive, but just to mention another example, our agribusiness industry is so diverse and so large. We are the largest exporters for commodities in the world, so we see a lot of technology following farmers, machinery, equipment, genetics, biotech. So we see this kind of movement or having access to technology and innovation as a differential. Sometimes the public sector lags behind because sometimes small companies are much more agile to tap to these benefits. But over the long run, we see research and development and innovation-based agendas penetrating the whole domestic market. So that's, at the end of the day, it's a good sign for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Where would you like to add something to? Yeah, go ahead.
É desafio, eu acredito, que o grande desafio nosso é exatamente fazer isso, com que a nossa legislação ela se adeque para que nós possamos trabalhar com o setor privado. Hoje nós ainda temos bastante desafio nessa linha e nós acreditamos muito nesse modelo de colaboração, porque o setor privado ele vai trazer input que nós não temos hoje no governo e o governo certamente vai construir para o cidadão e para o Estado todas essas necessidades de tecnologia que nós temos. Então, eu acho que essa abordagem de colaboração entre o setor privado e o setor do governo é muito importante e a gente também tem que vencer bastante essa barreira da legislação, como colocou muito bem a doutora Kati. Obrigada.
Thank you very much. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, we have 15 minutes, so let's open up the floor for 10 minutes, and then we'll go for one more minute of each panel for conclusion. I see one hand right there, third row, in the middle, please. If we can have the microphone, or if you can just speak loudly. Okay. That way we can tweet you on Twitter.
Thank you. This is Shivendra here. I'm from NASSCOM in India. This is more as a comment or a response to the question the moderator put in. I think within the ICT area, if you look at it, overall globally, there are two things happening. On one hand, because of some of the recession which is happening, you are seeing, a lot of unemployment. But on the other hand, there is a demand for very high-skilled people which is growing, which are very limited in supply. And that is causing a lot of movement of people from one part to the other. Now, the whole ICT landscape is undergoing a lot of business transformation, as you know, with movement from traditional to digital technologies. And what's happening is that a demand for people who are doing, let's say, big data or cloud computing or areas around that is increasing. In India, for example, you asked the question of public sector and private sector. In India, for example, we as an organization, we are the largest software services association in the world probably. We as an organization work with the government, because the ICT landscape has about 3.7 million people employed in India right now, which is quite a high number. But we still feel that there is a shortage of quality manpower. So the government has given us the mandate in this case, which we are an NGO, where we have looked at evolving some of the skill sets and working with the industry. So we meet the industry, we understand what their requirements are, and fill the gap between the education, formal education, and the requirements. And that's how a lot of evolution has happened in terms of development of the skills. So very much has to be led by the public sector, the government, but the private sector has to play a very key role if we need to bridge the gap, because the next war is going to be fought for skills, and that's what's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Miguel, maybe you mentioned return on investment. I think the gentleman also was talking about investment in the future. Can you share with us some examples of what the Inter-American Development Bank has done to analyze data and to prove to the governments that investing in the future in ICT, even though it doesn't return you a mandate in the next 4 years, but it's for the long run, for the greater good of the economy and of the people? Would you share with us some information that you have, please?
We are, in fact, doing it frequently because we are a development bank, so our way of working in the region is to support technically and financially the countries. When we support financially is through loans. For those loans to be approved, they have to have a return on investment analysis. And we had approved in the last 5 years at least 7 or 8 clearly focus on digital agenda projects. The last one in Panama. What we did is we worked with experts, consultants, private sector, a big private sector involvement. In fact, the representatives of the main chambers of commerce presented the project to the president of the country and the cabinet of ministers just 2 weeks ago in Panama, because it focuses on modernizing government procedures, in particular those related to trade, business creation, etc. But so what we do is we work with the private sector to do these hard numbers about how profitable the investment in ICTs is going to be, in this case, for the government of Panama. For the talent-related question, I fully agree with the gentleman that just spoke, and the foundation is a good idea. Some countries in Latin America replicating the formula. I feel that is somehow a temporary solution, so we really need to sit down, private sector and universities, academia, thinking of the longer term to put serious new content in the syllabus of the universities, but I fully agree, and some countries in Latin America are replicating that formula.
Thank you. Any other questions that we can get from the audience?
Meu nome é Fabrício, e o moderador falou no começo da discussão sobre a necessidade de apoio a startups, e eu pergunto, o que o Brasil tem feito para incentivar a criação de startups? Porque a burocratização aqui é muito grande, às vezes as pessoas tentam trabalhar, só que é muito complicado a abertura de empresa, e incentivo, esse tipo de coisa. Então, acho que tem alguém do Ministério da Ciência e Tecnologia.
Andre, would you take that from Apex? Thank you for the question.
Ok. Fabrício, se você não se importar, vou responder em inglês para poder contribuir com os panelistas. Well, for startup companies, we have some of the agendas that are in course right now. One of them is called the Startup Brasil, and the other one is the sector project we have together with Softex, one of the industry associations in Brazil that is also with us at the event. They are one of the sponsors. Together, these two programs, they try to support over 400 startup companies in Brazil in the technology-intensive sectors. And by being on the field with the companies, that's where we can have a very fine tuning and a very precise vision of what the obstacles are or what the challenges they face and what are the right mechanisms to overcome them. And just to share one of these points, we see many ICT companies in Brazil with fascinating technologies, innovative solutions, very creative processes, management techniques, everything. But one thing we see lacking in startup companies, not only in Brazil, but usually in emerging markets, is the organizational culture to go international or be competitive internationally or domestically on a sustainable way. By coming from an IT field of graduation, post-graduation, many of them are scientists, they become so focused on the technology and they tend to not look all the dimensions of the international business model. So we see some of them getting into some bureaucratical challenges or maybe legal apparatus to go to compete domestically and abroad. And the chief or the CEO or usually the managers, they have to step away from the technology field, which is what they like the most. And they have to turn themselves into managers of people, internal processes, internationalization strategies. And some of the startups, they have to step back one or two steps and then do the homework as companies and then turn back to their technologies and see how they can strive. So as a government agency, we try to be really close to these 400 companies we support and read from them what the obstacles are and try to tackle the obstacles as a group, as a sector. So I'll be more than happy to send you some more information on the programs that we have and discuss this further on with your specific case.
Thank you. Can I just get back to Kati? Maybe share some examples with your experience. You are a startup. What would you like to see governments do to have the openness, better cooperation? We talk with the private sector, or maybe share some examples of what countries have done, because I know the World Bank is doing the report on doing business while they constantly monitor the countries of how easy it is to open up a business, to start a business, to get supporter. And that is a very good report for even companies who decide where to open a company, entrepreneurs, I should say, who are looking for where to start a company. They always refer to this ease of doing business report from the World Bank, and they select that country where it's easiest, or what more, I should say, more convenient for them to start a business. So how about your experience?
Well, just a couple of comments. Perhaps in the Latin American context, since I've recently had a chance to do a report with the Inter-American Development Bank on digital trade in Latin America and understanding how companies that are somewhat digitally intensive, regardless of their sector, whether it's manufacturing, agriculture, and so forth, what are the barriers that they face? And when we asked them about the barriers for cross-border online trade, it seemed that the traditional barriers like market access, logistics, customs procedures were still significant hurdles, as were online payments. So you saw some of those issues that were echoed in the prior panel, but then we did case studies of the purely kind of digital play companies in payments, in logistics, in online work, e-commerce in Latin America. And it was interesting in those case studies, we pressed companies to tell us, well, what are the main hurdles that you face? What are the challenges from policy or government? And a lot of it boiled down to precisely on the doing business issues, that it's the traditional kind of doing business, setting up a business, overly burdensome red tape, taxation, things like that, that companies were struggling with. And I guess companies that were digital pure plays that were setting up in different countries in Latin America also encountered different regulations in those markets. So perhaps kind of tax harmonization, some regulatory coordination harmonization. I'm sure there's much more going on than I know, but it seemed that some of those traditional challenges of the region, where is market access or customs and so forth in trade or doing business, have also affected the digital companies, and this is probably something to rectify. And perhaps we have new ways. I'm actually working with the UN now to look at these digital barriers in somewhat different ways, kind of doing digital index, if you will, in the e-commerce space to capture some of the nuances there. But it seems that, you know, we still have much to do here to improve the business environment in general.
Yeah. Very good, thanks. There are a lot of reports. The World Economic Forum does the reports, OECD does the report. They all, when you combine them together, you receive a very complex matrix, but it gives you an idea where countries should focus their reforms when it comes to regulatory guillotine, for example. How about Miguel, from your side? You were mentioned you're working together. Anything you can add to this? What are some of the red tape that needs to be cut, or the private sector is asking from the governments they can cut on the red tape?
Look, if you allow me, Ivo, I would like to send a message more for the private sector, which is a majority here, than for the public one, where I have more opportunities. And I think the role of this gentleman here from the private sector is key, not just for the sake of the ICT business, which is important because we have businesses here, but for the benefit of many citizens that have not participated in this party yet. And I'm happy that was brought in here about the half of the world that is not connected, which in Latin America is the same thing. So what I think they can do, in my very modest view, is to open a dialogue with the government and put numbers on the table and tell them about the seriousness of what is not happening in some of these countries, and offer help. How can they help? We touch upon that. Do you need talent? I mean, one of the explanations why it takes so long to buy in government is because they don't know how to buy. They don't have the people. They don't have the people that know about data analytics. We have several companies that want to do things, and they don't find the interlocutor in the region. So first thing, help with the talent scarcity. Help with training or lending professionals. Second, investment. Offer to co-invest. Saying, listen, I so strongly believe in the return on investment of putting these procedures online that Kati was describing. I'm willing to take some risk with you and co-invest, for instance. Right? Offer advice in general. Offer the creation of bodies that monthly meet and help the government to come up with a national digital agenda, monitor it, have specific initiatives with investment allocated. So sorry about the brainstorming of things, but I guess the message is to come back to the countries, just call the government, because the private sector is respected, is listened to, is key for these countries, and convey the message about the relevance of having a serious national digital agenda with all the elements that we've listened to these 2 days. That would be my kind of take-home message.
Good, thank you. And I think with your message right now, we have 20 seconds left for our session, and I think it was a very good conclusion to wrap up the whole discussion that we had regarding what needs to be done in order to have a sustainable ICT sector. We were able to hear from the government of Brazil, from the agency of Brazil, from the private sector, from the multinational organization. I think there is a lot that needs to be done, but there are a lot of opportunities for the young generations to find a career path in the ICT sector. And I would like to stress that the most added value when it comes to the salary or the living standard, it comes from the ICT sector. Every report shows that. So the more people go in that field, I think they will have a better future. So with that in mind, thank you to my panelists, and thank you for the audience for listening to our session.